Well, we just had Tropical Storm Isaias come through, and unfortunately, it has done a bit of damage. Now, this isn't as bad as it seems. This is a full tree that's come down, and it's not the only one. But the trees that did come down were already basically halfway down. They were knocked over by Sandy and still survived, sort of leaning. But they had to come down sometime, and this happened to be the storm that did it. Now, while I do care about my trees quite a bit, this is, as I said, it's a long time coming at this point. 8 years ago, they were already leaning badly. It's a miracle they survived then, and something had to bring them down eventually. Now, these are some big trees that were lost, but luckily, while I wouldn't say they're common species, they're common enough that they should be easy to replace. There are still surviving examples on the property, and this particular one's a big-tooth aspen, quick growing, so that should be no issue to replace, with a time frame of 50 to 60 years. And luckily, this is really the only tree I can guarantee is dead. There are others that have fallen further than they were during Sandy and afterwards, but they still might survive. Trees are very tenacious, and I'll just have to see. Here's down where the falling originated. You'll notice that these were basically already leaning on the aspen. This is a hickory, and honestly, this is going to be the hardest to replace if it is in fact dead. It was listing already pretty badly, and it's survived until now, but I don't know, I'm going to have to monitor it, and some of these parts might not survive, others might. It's kind of hard to tell at the moment, but as I said, this is unfortunately a more difficult tree to replace. These grow very, very slowly, in contrast to the aspens, which grow very, very quickly. As far as aspens go, a lot of people would say this isn't an aspen, it has to be something else. Very few big-tooth aspens get this big and get this type of bark. Luckily though, this is not the oldest big-tooth aspen on the property. There are ones that are bigger. Luckily. I mean, this is one of them that was huge, and unfortunately it came down. And there's another one that I can't quite find right now that's also right nearby. It's that one right there is also a big-tooth aspen. That one's in danger of coming down, but it should survive a little while longer, maybe long enough to spread its seeds, which I might collect, because I would like to replace this if it does die, which it almost certainly will at this point. I'd love to replace this with another big-tooth aspen. Now, as you can see from all the stuff that's grown up around it, this particular tree has been down for quite some time now. It's unfortunate because these hickories grow very slowly. They're the slowest growing of all the trees. But that also means that if this does die, I'm probably not going to replace it with one of its own species, because this species is a shade-growing tree. There are already multiple hickories in stages of growth in other places that will take its spot elsewhere. I mean, you don't have to plant a specific tree species in the exact same spot. And honestly, it would be non-advantageous to do so with this particular species, because it just wouldn't shade things out quick enough. Whereas, if you can honestly see right here, that tree is another big-tooth aspen. Might even be the offspring of the one that fell. And due to the circumstances of where it's growing, I don't know if it'll survive, but I do think either this one survives and it takes the place of the hickory, or I plant another one that does, because the big-tooth aspens will maintain the forest ground cover and keep invasive species at bay, whereas the hickory will not for a long time. And as for the champion big-tooth aspen on the property, here it is. Now, this is by no means the biggest in the world or anything, but I'd certainly estimate it to be at least in the top 10,000. I mean, come on. Look at the size of this thing. Now, this is a tree that will barely grow to beyond a foot in diameter. If it's lucky, it'll grow a little bit bigger, but this one has survived for a long, long time. And on the bright side, it can be a really good time to figure out what kind of trees certain trees are. I could not for the life of me figure out what that was conclusively. I had suspicions that it was a type of white oak, but, you know, with its size, I can't look at the leaves, and bark is kind of difficult to go by. But now that green leaves have been torn off of a lot of trees, this is natural, of course. During a big storm, they're going to lose some, they'll recuperate. But that's a white oak leaf, so maybe I might even take these back to do some better, more conclusive identification, figure out exactly what kind of species it is. Come to think of it, if the one big-tooth aspen by the hickory dies, I might replace it not with a big-tooth aspen, but a quaking aspen, since there are multiple big-tooth aspens on the property of very large size and a lot of young ones that have a good chance of growing because they're not very shaded out. But there's only really one big quaking aspen on the property and a couple of little babies. But they do have good chances, but why count on it? So yeah, while it's not great news that these trees have fallen, it's not really a tragedy unless they don't get replaced by other native trees. Because, I mean, trees fall and die and then get replaced. That's just how the nature of the forest works. It's only really bad if, in the long run, they get replaced by non-native invasive species instead. As for what to do with all this wood, I do want to leave a substantial portion of it, especially stuff that I obviously can't use because it's too rotted. I mean, there's no shortage of that rotted wood around here, but, you know, the woodpeckers are here, they love the place, and I'd like them to stay for the future. So, I mean, with no shortage of wood, I can certainly take a little bit to use, especially considering if I take it, use it to make something that's pretty permanent, the wood stays out of the carbon cycle, and this tree has done a lot of good work taking carbon out of the atmosphere. Personally, I say it's a shame to let it go back so quickly, and in my opinion, turning a tree like this that has already died and fallen into something wonderful and artistic and beautiful is sort of a second life for it. In my opinion, it would be reasonable, natural, but slightly a shame to either burn it or just let it rot. And speaking of tropical storm, look at all that water. Honestly, even as shallow as it is, that kind of water motion's probably enough to sweep you off your feet if you aren't careful. Those rocks are pretty slippery. And also, I'm very, very glad that the storm didn't knock down any of the more irreplaceable trees, like that American elm right there. Well, elm. I'm not 100% sure that it's an American elm, but I know it's a native elm. I'm not that great with tree identification. I'm not a botanist. But anyway, I've been rambling on for long enough at this point. At any rate, I hope that at least some of these trees survive. Maybe not the two I most talked about, but this one off to the side. Maybe that ash tree will live a little longer. And that other big-tooth aspen might still survive a few years more. Anyway, hope you guys learned something. See ya.